Hello, and welcome to our lecture today. Today, I want to talk to you about the witch craze in early modern Europe. And although we typically associate the killing of alleged witches with an event in British North American history in Salem in the late 17th century, our class on early modern Europe gives us an example of that, or tells us rather, that what happens in British North America is not a misnomer in history, but rather a part of a broader pattern of accusations of witchcraft, mostly held towards women, but also men, that occurred between around 1455 and the early 1700s. So if you're trying to figure this out, there are hundreds of years of what is called this witch craze. It's happening predominantly in Western Europe. You're going to see, I found this online. I'm going to use this guy's slideshow. Don't really know who he is, because I like the pictures and it does convey some of the points I wanted to make to you today. If you look and see, there are a lot of slides here. I'm not going to go over all of them. I will post the link in the classroom and you can certainly go back and look at many of them on your own. But I do want to just spend some time with you going over the concept, sort of the statistics of this hysteria, as well as the imagery that is included in this slideshow that I think really helps to bring this this history to light. All right. Cause and effects of this witch hysteria, right? So in many ways, what happens in British North America and Salem, Massachusetts mirrors, right? It's very similar to this whole witch craze that's going on much longer and in much more dire results in Western Europe. There is the sort of physical assault that will happen to, again, mostly women, in terms of the focus on the female body, which is really interesting. And we're going to spend some time looking at this. But there's a whole sort of cottage industry that grows that helps to identify who is and who is not a witch. And again, the focus is on the female body. And of course, in order to know if a woman is a witch, you're going to have to take her clothes off, inspect her very closely. So sort of physical body takes on very interesting proportions in this conversation, as well as sort of the psychological components. What is driving people to do this, to accuse one another of these practices. And of course, sociologically, we can also look at how the Protestant Reformation, changing of technology, the wars of religion that are also causing people to have to flee their homes, seek refuge, and basically survive, is creating this social problem. It is also a cultural problem, in that not only are these ideas of religion very much at war with one another, but it's really shaping a culture of accusation, of not knowing who to trust. And I also think, as you go through this, and we are going to talk about this week in the discussion, is what parallels do you see between contemporary political disruptions and the use of fear as a political and cultural tool? Perhaps you might find some parallels to our contemporary environment. All right. Like I said, I'm not going to go over all of these, but it's important to think that about just how destructive of a force that this is. And although when we look at the idea of witch crazes and accusations from a modern analytical viewpoint, we might go, well, that seems so silly, right? How can that happen? But if you substitute witch for other words like, communist or never Trumper or something along those lines, you might understand the power of the accusation itself. So if we move past sort of the issue of witches, right, what we're really talking about is power, how power is demonstrated, how the use of rhetoric and specific words create such hysteria over things. And oh, right. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is how a lot of this hysteria is going to be sort of over the concern of children. So I don't know how sort of much you're paying attention to. There's a lot of news to pay attention to, but the emergence of these QAnon conspiracists, and they claim that they have unearthed a diabolical worldwide plot that is designed for pedophilia, sexual traffic rings, right, and harming children. So I have a point here. A lot of this witchcraft hysteria will be under in the guise of we have to do this to protect the community. There is a corrosive element, a cancer that must be removed because it's harmful for the family and children. And that sentiment, right, can be found today. We may not be using the term witches to describe who is involved, but the idea of sort of creating a panic, a hysteria, if you will, over under the guise of helping the children continues to be as a very powerful idea. All right. And in the book Witchcraft, the Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe, author Brian Levac Stantz makes the following comment. And he writes, witchcraft is often referred to, at least by skeptics, as an imagined crime, an elaborate fantasy that has no foundation in reality. Those who were tried as witches, therefore, are viewed as innocent victims in a deluded judiciary and an oppressive legal system. Are these assumptions valid? Did the European witch hunt produce thousands of criminals who had not actually committed any crimes? Or did witches actually perform some of the deeds which they were prosecuted? I imagine the answer is probably the first. And there's a lot in here I said about sort of the practice of the sort of the daily practice of witchcraft, what that looks like, how that's different from like devil worshiping and such. But you can take a look at all of this on yourself. And although the title of this site is A Complicated View, right, it really should be Witches Are Female. So there's no way for me as a scholar who uses gender and ecofeminism within my own work to look at this and not to sort of have the overwhelming understanding that this is about gender. This is very much about power and gender. And although, again, men are accused, it is predominantly women. All right. All right. So one, I'm going to skip forward. This is the difference between maleficium and diabolism. And this is, again, sort of making the distinction between magic and devil worship. So, again, the importance here is when you start to drill down on the actual data, we see that nearly 100,000 people between the 1500s and the 1700s are accused or prosecuted of witchcraft. 60,000 of them are executed. So that's a staggering amount of people. That's a staggering amount of women. It's a staggering amount of those who are going to die. It is a handful, obviously, in Salem, Massachusetts, and again, 60,000 in Western Europe. So this goes on for a considerable amount of time with a very high death rate. If we, again, sort of drill down on the statistics, we would find that in different regions, like Freiburg, between 1607 and 1683, 53 of 163 are executed. So 33% of those charged. In other regions, right, 90 out of 102. So 90%. So if we look at different communities, and this happens really across Germany, it's not known, it's not the modern country of Germany yet. It is a collection of German provinces. So these are individually run sort of kingdom city states, if you will, where the transition from Catholicism to Protestantism is creating a variety of problems. The issue of this women-specific witchcraft problem is also emerging, as in many of these places, what we would also find are women landowners. So there is this correlation between women landowners and accusations of witchcraft. All right. He goes back to biblical texts to find examples and mentionings of witchcraft, right? Excuse me. But in 1231, Pope Gregory, what is that? The ninth begins the Inquisition. Witchcraft officially declared to be heresy. And as we have discussed previously, one of the sort of transition period between the Middle Ages and the early modern period is this sort of political, legal application of torture. As we also are going to talk about, these ideas of being possessed by the devil and engaging in the devil have a number of important sort of, there's a number of insights you can have on this, right? One thing that he doesn't talk about in the slideshow, but I would like to bring up, is that oftentimes this panic over children, this moral panic, if you will, that is happening will also have a link to some sort of religious prosecution. So it should not be shocking to you to know that Jews are also sort of accused of witchcraft, if not witchcraft specific, then some sort of heinous crime towards children. So there's also a famous example from around the 1400s of a child that goes missing in Germany. No one can find it. It's a terrible crime, and it is very much pinned on a Jewish man. And the death of the child is used to justify expelling and murdering the Jewish townspeople in this particular town, which again I can't think of the name at the time. So he's outlining all the ways that one would find themselves sort of entering into a pact with the devil, which is interesting, right? There is the idea that if this is sort of a long-standing theme in Christian literature. But what happens if you make a deal with the devil? Usually you would sign your name in some sort of book. You would have sort of unlimited power. Oftentimes there is the belief, and of course this is much more specific for women, that in order to have a contract with the devil, then that means also sexual encounters between women and this male devil. Regardless, right, if you have any sort of pact with the devil, according to this sort of Christian theology, that you're going to get a mark on your body. So whether it's a freckle or a mole or perhaps some sort of interesting skin lesion, right? The devil leaves a mark for someone to identify. The other thing to note here that I think is really interesting, right? There is also the idea of eating and killing infants. So this idea that devil worship involves infant sacrifice, right, plays right into exactly what I'm saying. This, using this fear of harm to children as a way to legally and even perhaps politically dispose of unwanted people in the community. All right. So what you see here is are carvings, engravings from the book the Compendium Maleficarum, which is published around 1608. So this is after there's a printing press. There is sort of a printing revolution going on, if you will, with this being one of the more popular books. And it basically is a guide to instruct how the devil does this, how you can identify if someone has been possessed by the devil, the sort of forms the devil takes, and a guide to understanding how to do this. So if you see right here, right, this is children obviously being burned, right? This sort of, again, talking about that theme, that fear of what evil people do to children. Here you have an example of the devil coming into contract with a devil worshiper, again, engaging in some sort of ritual to seal this contract. Here's another example of people sitting around sort of conjuring the evil spirits. And then the witch's mark. Again, as I said before, these beliefs that are now in books, right? So I read in a book. A book said, if the devil comes to me, I will have a mark. And now I have a mark. I'm accused of witchcraft. She has a mole right here. This is going to be used legally as justification for not only an accusation, but persecution and execution. So there becomes a number of mechanisms published that come with this book, again, to explain, identify, and to guide someone as to how they deal with the propensity of witches around them. As I said before, easy and very common to become a target. Jews are targeted, unmarried women, and those who do not attend church, which are a number of people. If your region is engaged in a holy war between Catholics and Protestants, the idea that people don't really want a part of that is very understanding, right? But this also becomes a way to get to those people too, who will sort of won't pick a side, if you will. There are also other ideas like those who have made contact with the devil. They have the ability to fly. They can metamorphosize. And again, the idea is humans would not be able to sort of trust what they're seeing, right? It's about trickery, possession. So there's a number of ways that humans are sort of tested with this. With these belief systems. So we see in parts of France, Switzerland, again, these are regions that are once strongly Catholic regions that are going through a number of issues, whether with the monarchy or perhaps with religious ideas or moving away from the church. There are a number of disruptions going on. And there's the idea that people are meeting in secret. They are devouring infants. They are flying to ceremonies. They are doing all of these things. And that a rebellion is going to strike. Now, perhaps these are Catholic priests who are starting to see people unhappy. Again, it's important to sort of unpack what else is generating this sort of social tension, but it's certainly related to these major disruptions in religion as one. Malleus Maleficarum. Again, this becomes sort of a legal guide for the persecution of witches, or at least accused witches. So 3 sort of main sections in this work: the philosophy of witchcraft, power of witches, how they recruit others, and more notably, right, this is the Malleus Maleficarum is considered a legal text. How you prosecute, how you execute a witch. And again, this becomes popularly pressed. It becomes a bestseller, if you will, and it becomes a legal guide how to prosecute in secular court. All right. There are some quotes that you can read on your own. There's some ideas about criminal prosecution, and sort of changes that will come to the legal system as a result of this. Now, what the Malleus Maleficarum very much instructs, which picks up on a common thread of torture that had been around since the Middle Ages, is it's all about the body. We're going to really focus the attention on the human body. Perhaps this is done, again, because of gender, or perhaps this is also a layover of this fixation of the body that's also around in medieval Europe. As we know today, right? I don't know how you feel about the practice of torture, whether it's military torture or the use of torture in prisons, or however you understand examples of torture. But torture does not necessarily produce accurate information. There's lots of evidence to suggest torturing someone actually gets them to admit things that are false. So keep that in mind too. What we know is that many times when people are tortured, they will say whatever you want, even if it's not the truth, right? Why are so many witches condemned? There's abundance of evidence about this, and that, people admit to crimes that they did not do in the face of torture. So let's look at some of these, right? There is obviously the rack. This had been around for hundreds of years, a medieval torture device where the human body is put on these sort of, you're strung up by your four limbs, and then this contraption is turned by these long sticks, sort of basically pulling you apart. Thumbs and leg screws. These look fairly self-evident. We're going to screw these things into your legs. There is always the head clamp. This certainly becomes more well recognized and certainly used by slave traders and on the enslaved bodies. This is, of course, is a chair of spikes. You sit on that. The strapido, a pulley system which raises the victim off the floor by arms. You can be sort of jerked up violently and sort of squashed as well. I guess that's the strapido right there. There it is. Swimming a witch. So this becomes a very popular form of torture. Women are dunked or tied or thrown into the water. Obviously, if you're guilty, as a witch, you would float. Your body would float up because of I'm not exactly sure. And then they would know you're a witch and kill you. And if you're innocent, your body's going to stink. But good news, you are accepted as being holy and accepted religiously, so you will go to heaven if you are killed by the state. So he asked the question, does anyone see a problem with this? I can imagine you do, right? So here are some examples of what this would look like in practice, this practice of swimming or drowning women, and this becomes another very famous one. So the idea behind the violence, again, is to get people to admit it in court, right? That's the idea. There are, I'm just sort of struck by all of this right now. There's an example of a woman from in 1631 and a torturer, and it was revealed the torturer is actually sort of abusing the law, right? The idea that people could use torture in these extra legal ways or use it too much is also potentially a problem. And even in this case in 1631, it seems like it has. And the torturer, interestingly enough, is a job no one wants. That it was a job that those who were also sort of socially isolated from society took, right? You're not friendly with your torturer. Also, your torturer usually is going to have a hood on their face, covering their face, as if people know who the torturer is, um, that person also becomes a target. So that is an interesting sort of development culturally, right? That the hangman, the torturer, is considered a social pariah whose face is covered, and he sort of lives in fear of, ironically, lives in fear of the same public that he is killing. Um, in this case, right, the hangman who is accused of committing too much torture had a pregnant woman who was accused of witchcraft, and he tortured her over 56 times. All right. So, what kind of offenses would get the accusation of witchcraft? Well, I'm so glad you asked me. I know you've been thinking that the entire time. Dr. Underwood, what is it that would get the accusation? Well, miscarriages, right? Miscarriages. Did you not want the child? Did you do something? This becomes, because there's not a lot of scientific or biological explanation at this point for miscarriages, this becomes one way to as women find themselves being accused. Which is ironic, as they're accused of creating a miscarriage, but we have examples of the torture obviously leading to miscarriages and the death of both infants, fetuses, as well as the woman themselves. Other things, obviously, that will get noted is infidelity, the accusation of certainly not believing in God. Those kinds of things would also get the accusation of witchcraft. Here we see a number of really interesting depictions of many of these executions, right? This being one of the most famous, this multi-hanging of women that occurs during this moment in time. And then there's even sort of a literary depiction of the famous sort of witch hunters, right, who go out and find transgressive women and bring them into the galleys. So let's really drill down here very quickly about the impact on the Reformation, right? So with the creation of this entirely new understanding of Christianity, it's again creating a swell of disruptions, new fear that the devil will increase, that with even printing, you could have greater access to evil ideas and practices of demonology. And sort of the greater the rift, the greater the conflict that's growing, not only between Catholics and Protestants, but within the Protestant community, right? As all Protestants do not but practice the same way. There are a number of new sects that are forming, from Calvinism to Presbyterianism to Puritanism, and these different versions of Christian Protestant beliefs are also fighting with one another. So it's creating a number of issues that are really finding themselves located here on the physical harm of a woman's body. Excuse me. So in some places, right, we as I mentioned before, you see males who are accused. At one town in Germany, have about 200 males with over 1,000 females. Here, another example: 9 males, 181 females, 160 males, 1,400 female in Hungary. So we see that played out over time. What we also see in Geneva, Switzerland, 95 witches are over the age of 50, right? So these are women after childbearing age. These are women who perhaps aren't married. These are women who perhaps are being transgressive of other social norms, and potentially who are being accused. Certainly in the example of Salem, Massachusetts, that's 118 witches, 42% over the age of 50. So typically, there is a steady stream of declining of this by the late 1600s and throughout the 1700s, although it continued in parts of Norway until 1725, continues in parts of Hungary until 1777. Um, but sort of typically with the era of what is coming with the Enlightenment and sort of the impact of science, there is the idea that these events go away. As I wrap up here, I want you to consider again sort of what you know about Salem. There's some interesting information here, and the character of Tituba, as she is the Caribbean enslaved woman who also much of this to whom much of this is blamed in Salem. But I want you to think about the effects on British North America, and the long-term effects, right? And what are the sort of cellular effects of this as well? And not only the accusation, but the concept of torture, how we understand the impact to the legal system. And I want you to also think, and I want to talk about this week, as I mentioned, do you see comparisons between now and then? I mean, again, I'm often struck as I'm reading so much about the early modern European period, just the eerie similarities that I see between this particular time in history and now. So take your time to look at the end. I know I've been going for a while. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about this witch craze and what you think it means and the ways that we can really unpack this moment in time. Thank you so much.